Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to do an image quality comparison between the new DJI Pocket 4 and the old DJI Pocket 3 without doing any extra manipulation in post-production. What you see right now is basically how the image looks straight out of camera. But if I'm shooting in log, I'm going to use the official LUT from DJI to convert D-Log basically to Rec 709, but I'm not going to do anything extra in post-production. Let's do some backlighting tests to see which one produces a wider dynamic range. And by the way, I'm using face tracking on both cameras just to make it a bit easier, when moving the cameras around. As you can see, it works really well. The Pocket 4 seems like adjust the exposure a bit slower than the Pocket 3. Let me do it again. So I'm backlighting and now front lighting. Yeah, Pocket 3 is a bit quicker to, readjust the exposure. Pretty much flat lighting in here, so you can clearly see which one produces better colors. Also, which one is sharper. Man, this fly is annoying. Go home or something. I'm working here. Let's see here, front lighting. They look very similar, but it's a bit more faded on the Pocket 3 compared to the 4, which is a bit more contrasty and clean looking. Backlighting, stress test, dynamic range performance. We have a fisherman in here. When I grow up, I want to be a fisherman. Couple more selfie comparisons. This is super stressful for both cameras right now. All right, and now I switch to the standard picture profiles. And by the way, another thing that I want to mention is that when you use D-Log on the new Pocket 4, you are limited to one ISO range, which is 400 to 6400. You cannot change it to lower than 400 for whatever reason. Maybe the base ISO of D-Log on the Pocket 4 is 400. So basically, if you want to get the widest dynamic range, maybe you should use ISO 400, even with manual settings, to get the best performance. But maybe I'm wrong, I'm not really sure. The image on the Pocket 4 looks a bit more contrasty and darker, whereas the image on the Pocket 3 seems a bit brighter and faded. So it might be that the algorithm on the Pocket 3 exposes the image a bit brighter by default compared to the Pocket 4. And the colors also look a bit different on the Pocket 4 compared to the 3. They look a bit more neutral, at least to me, especially the skin. All right, so right now I'm using manual exposure on both of these cameras. And a couple of things that I've noticed is that, first of all, yes, the base ISO for the Pocket 4 is definitely 400 when shooting in D-Log, because even in manual settings, you cannot go below ISO 400 with this camera. So if you want to maintain the proper motion blur in your shot, you will need more powerful, more strong ND filters compared to the Pocket 3, because the base ISO in here is 50 when shooting in D-Log M. And then also, I've set the white balance manually to 5000 Kelvin, and I noticed that now in the Pocket 4, there is an option to adjust the tint of the color from like magenta or green, which is really nice, because sometimes the image on the Pocket 3 would lean towards magenta. So basically now we have the option to exactly dial in the colors in camera, so then we won't have to spend a lot of time in post-production fixing and color correcting these issues. All right, now let's do something a bit more challenging. I'm backlighting myself, so hopefully this will stress the dynamic range performance of these cameras. If I'm looking on the screens here, maybe there's a bit more highlight detail in here, right in here with the Pocket 4, but I can't really say for certain. It's just that the image on the Pocket 3 looks really faded and flat because you don't have the color recovery option. All right, let's do like a full body shot in here to see which one performs better. I exposed for the highlights around me for the most part, so hopefully you'll be able to see the difference on which camera you can see the details of me a bit better. Also an autofocus test, if you will. All right, now let's do a D-Log flexibility test, if you will. So basically, I overexposed both of these shots manually. I'm overexposed by about a stop, maybe a stop and a half. And then in post-production, I'm going to bring down the exposure to see which one retains highlight information a bit better, because sometimes when quickly exposing your shots in the field, it can happen that you overexpose the shot by accident. So let's see which one is a bit more flexible. And then after this, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to underexpose myself and then bring up the exposure to see which one handles noise a bit better. And of course, I'm using the base ISOs on both of these cameras to keep it as fair and neutral as possible. All right, and now I did the exact opposite. I basically underexposed myself by about a stop. And now in post-production, I'm going to bring up the exposure to get proper exposure on my skin. And you pay attention to which camera introduces more noise in the shadows after raising up the exposure, the Pocket 4 or the Pocket 3. If I had to guess, I would say the Pocket 3 is going to be slightly cleaner in the shadows compared to the 4, but let's see. All right, and now let's do a studio quality comparison. I'm filming again in D-Log on the Pocket 4 and D-Log M on the Pocket 3, but I'm using the automatic exposure and white balance settings on both cameras to let them basically adjust everything for me. And from what I could see on the screens, it seems like both of these cameras significantly overexpose my skin. So I might have to reduce the exposure slightly in post-production later on. But hopefully this gives you a rough idea on how these cameras perform in a studio environment with, lots of lights basically. But now let me adjust the exposure manually and see if it looks any better. All right, and now here is how these cameras look with manual exposure and white balance settings. Hopefully it looks a bit better to my eyes, at least from looking at the screens. It looks a bit cleaner than with automatic exposure and white balance settings. And also I've adjusted the tint on the Pocket 4 just to make my skin tones look a bit better. So hopefully this looks a bit better than automatic exposure, because I basically forced these cameras more or less to use the lowest ISO possible to get the cleanest image. I'm using ISO 400 on the Pocket 4 and then ISO 100 on the Pocket 3. I could have gone to 50, but then the exposure would not match basically between these cameras. So I feel like 100 on the Pocket 3 is going to be enough basically to compare these cameras. All right, and now just for the fun of it, here is how they compare in the studio with the normal picture profile. And I'm not going to do anything to these shots at all, because from looking at the screens, they look really well exposed, even with automatic exposure, basically. But I would highly recommend using D-Log as much as possible on both of these cameras, just to have the most flexibility when color grading in post-production. And you might even notice that my skin looks a bit more pleasing when shooting in D-Log compared to the standard picture profile. But you let me know down below which one you prefer, D-Log or normal picture profile. All right, and now let's do a low light comparison. I'm gonna start with the log picture profiles. This is automatic exposure settings and also automatic white balance. I barely have any light in this room. I dimmed down all the lights basically, except this window in here. The window is kind of bright, but I'm gonna walk away from the window just to here. Have some lights in here, but they are pretty dim. Let me actually turn this off. I feel like here in the corner, it's the darkest. So it should give you like a really good idea. Those are like which one produces better low light results. All right, and now this is the low light mode on both of these cameras. No picture profile is not available on either of them. Which one looks cleaner? From what I could see on the screen, actually, the Pocket 4 looks a bit cleaner. I'll actually track myself as well. Active track is not supported in low light mode on the Pocket 3, so that's also something different between these cameras. All right, and finally, here is how these cameras compare with the normal picture profile in video mode, so not D-Log and no D-Log M. The skin looks slightly better to me on the Pocket 4 compared to the 3, but in terms of noise, I can't really see the difference, at least, from judging with these tiny screens on these cameras. Let's go right in here. Super dark in here. I think I'm using like ISO 4000 on the Pocket 4. Anyhow, thank you for watching. Let me know down below what you think about these cameras in terms of like the image quality. And I guess I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.